All right, everyone. Let us raise our glasses of bottled water and give a toast to the last day of the semester. Cheers. All right, congratulations. You've gotten this far. We will get you to the finish line. And let's pray first. We're going to rejoice with one of our online students, Scott, and his family. His wife gave birth on April 10th to Caleb Axel Thompson. So we'll pray for this family as we rejoice the birth of little Caleb. And we'll just pray for everyone and as we all make the mad dash to the finish line this semester. So let's join with me in prayer. Lord, thank you so much for the beauty of your day that reminds us of your grace and your love for us, your care for us. Lord Jesus, your promise that whoever takes your yoke upon us, you will give rest and peace for our souls. Lord, so oftentimes we take the wrong yoke upon ourselves and we get ourselves in trouble or we get ourselves exhausted or stressed out or overwhelmed. But remind us of that, as I'm sure many of the students here and at home are a bit stressed out as we approach the end of the semester. Lord, I pray for just a joy that would fall upon these students, and they'd be reminded of your love and grace in the little details of their own lives and their families and their friends that are there to encourage them. Speak through those and bring encouragement. Lord, I pray that you multiply their time and their energy as they finish creative writing assignments and research projects and study for final exams, Lord, for this class as well as other classes. So we lift these requests to you and any unspokens that are in this room, and for those who are at home, we pray and lift these things up to you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right. Well, let me do this for you to help you consolidate your preparation for this class. As I've already announced, the final exam in this class, I've posted an announcement now on Blackboard with a new final exam portal that'll have all of anything that I have related to final exam will be there. The first thing that I've put there is a PowerPoint set that includes all of the slides that you need to review. That's the content for the final exam. So from the wisdom books, Samuel, Kings, and Chronicles, and Esther, Nehemiah, and Esther, all of those books are in that set. So you don't have to go back and cut and paste or copy or splice or whatever you do. So it's all there. And remember the real source of gold there is the combination of the notes that you've taken as well as the speaker notes that I have under each slide. So make sure you hit the little button that says speaker notes, and it opens up the extra box underneath the PowerPoint slide so you can see the image, follow along and lecture, go back and say, hey, what did he say about that? And if whatever you want to do, it kind of helps to streamline things a little bit there. So the final exam will consist of some basic true, false, multiple choice, but then at the end there'll be some essays. And remember my emphasis after the midterm. I'm really looking for you to write an essay, not a copy and paste exercise. Please don't give me bullet point lists that come from your notes or your preparation notes or whatever you have. What an essay is you're thinking about what you've reviewed and putting it all together in an essay that makes sense from start to finish. So sentences, full sentences, linked together that say something, basically to answer a question. That's an essay. And, you're not going to be able to Google search anything for my final exam. Just do a little prepare. So I'm going to help you do your preparation. So you can focus between now and then. The test window will be from the first day of the final exam week, which is this coming Friday, to the following Wednesday, right? That's the final exam test window. So in this class, the final exam link will be live, right, during that whole time. All right, so let's just talk about kind of what I call the centers of gravity. And this is to help you focus more on what would maybe become an essay question. Don't be overwhelmed by the size. I'm just giving you places to go back and focus your review and your thoughts and preparation. And I'm just giving you a little thought that's under my hat here as a professor. what's more valuable to me oftentimes is in my experience as a student, was the preparation that I put into a final exam rather than what letter grade I got on the performance day. Because oftentimes the preparation notes that I use to prepare become a source for something else down the road. I keep them, I organize them, and I save them. And I say, yeah, what did that zany professor, Dr. Smith, ask me about the book of Job and righteous suffering, where here I am in ministry, and I'm actually trying to help somebody that's going through and asking that same question. I can go back and say, what did he say that might be helpful to my, present situation? So you'll see those kinds of things showing up with an essay type focus on the final exam. So for starters, you know how cranky I get about how books end, and how in some cases how books begin, as we've talked about these books, starting with the wisdom books. So like in Psalms, when we had our conversation on Psalms and how Psalms begins, Psalms 1 and 2 per se, that kind of aligns really well with the whole theme, the big mega themes, the bookends idea, right? Of God as king, God extending the idea of life, and the tree planted by the streams of flowing water idea that comes right out of Psalm 1, right? Those are kinds of things that really get my attention about some of the things that we've talked about. So that, the book of wisdom, and then we talked about Samuel, and some of these things might be found, in the middle of a book, like the Davidic covenant or something like that. How the book of Kings ends. We had a little conversation about how Kings ends and how Chronicles ends. Of course, our big let them go up idea. You'll hear more about that today. All of those things are, the authors are evaluating the past, but with an eye to the future. So there's this future theme that we try to tie into, right? That has really caught our attention a lot this semester. So focus on the way the beginnings or endings of these books each contributes to that theme. The idea of, you might think broadly, eschatological encouragement. So we'll talk more about that in a little bit. Another area that I want you to focus your thinking on as you prepare is some books have a unique process. I'm largely thinking of some of the wisdom books that we talk about. So the corpus of all that went into Proverbs, how did we get our book of Psalms? And we had a little class discussion on that kind of talked about what is a proverb and where did it come from? We had a little discussion in class about that. So that might be helpful. Number 3 here is the theme of good and what I called adversity. Not bad or evil, but the Hebrew word that really means adversity, as it relates to where did the idea come from, adversity, and then what do the biblical authors do as they reflect on their situation, talking to their audiences, given the world events going around at the time, and what are they trying to do to encourage their audience, thinking about good and adversity. So little scenic overlooks that we had along the way with regards to the conversation on good and adversity. That took us obviously to the book of Job. That took us to, we had a little conversation in the book of Ecclesiastes where the authors are talking about that idea. You can even refer to other books that didn't come in this class per se, although we did refer to them, like I would argue the prophet Jeremiah's discussion coming out of Lamentations 3. So this idea of good and adversity kind of tracks along the way, and you can comment about that. Just think about that a little bit as you prepare. Of course, we spent a lot of time talking about the big idea of Job, that timeless message of righteous suffering. So in class, just go back and review your notes on that. And in a way that intersects with other biblical authors in their discussion. So I guess I'm overlapping a little bit here, but I think when you think of Job as a timeless book and its influence on various people groups who were asking that big question. For example, the exiles who were in Babylon, along the way. Why are we suffering? What's God up to? That kind of thing. And then we talked about a little bit, we spent some time I like the idea of looking at the books, not just Nehemiah, but the book of Ezra as well, and particularly because of the first-hand account that these books come to us in, the use of the first person I. This is what happened to us and me and what I did. It's really Ezra and Nehemiah together. We talked about both of those individuals as leaders and the focus of spiritual leadership. That's kind of a helpful idea that comes out of, so of an overarching, go back and look at the scenic overlooks where we stopped and said, yeah, here's another example of Ezra's leadership. Here's an example of Nehemiah, and something that was unique about him that becomes a timeless principle for anybody out there who's trying to be a spiritual leader. What are those timeless walkaways that we found, as well as. And finally, it's interesting about the book, it strikes me, about the book of Esther. We talked about this. We'll talk about this today and finish out our conversation on Esther. Where the name of God, Elohim or Yahweh, doesn't appear in the text per se, we saw, and we'll see more today, so don't stress out too much. We saw example after example of how God is showing up behind the scenes, or with the use of an American idiom, under the hood of the automobile. God is at work despite him being referenced directly. That's interesting. And that's kind of some special things. Subtly, we see in terms of irony, sometimes the biblical author, as we'll talk about today, uses irony in such a way that it focuses on, wasn't this ironic? God's showing up again. God's sovereign over situations in history, especially as it relates to his people and what God's trying to do, and working through the faithfulness and fidelity of behind-the-scenes special ops individuals like Esther and like Mordecai. So, all right, that being said, those are some scenic overlook places that I want to give to you. So that helps you, fair enough, focus your time and preparation. And, I would say if I was trying to be a, top dog student, if I had a little time, I'd actually write an essay in advance and kind of collect my thoughts. That way, most of what you think I'm getting at, I'm not trying to be, I'm not trying any trickery here. I'm trying to be real honest. I think I'm asking you to, in your preparation, you can write an essay. Think about it when you're not under the pressure of a final exam day, 2-hour time slot, and allow that to be fodder for your full response. I mean, there might be a little extra thing I throw in you might have to think about and comment on, but this is not, none of these are specifically, this is not the official question. This is just kind of getting you at the general idea. Fair enough? Anybody? Question? Yeah. Online.
They can't see it online because of how the
this slide, it is.
They said the study guide's over on there. Is that what you showed?
Look, that's what I went back to my office to correct just now. So if you go back to week 14 folder, assignment folder, download the PowerPoint on that's there for week 14. That's today.
Yeah.
This slide was added.
That is on there. Okay.
It is now.
Okay.
So just go back and update your slides for this week. That's what I had to fix because for some reason it didn't get transferred over. All right. Any other questions? Okay. All right. Let's dive into the text. How many of you have ever talked to a Jewish person about their feast of Purim or their holiday of Purim? Anybody had any meaningful conversations lately? Well, you should, because it's a great conversation to have if you have a Jewish friends, to ask them about Purim. Let's talk about Purim. This is a little scenic overlook detour. It's not going to show up in your final exam as an essay question. I didn't mean it that way, but so let's turn to the book of Esther, first of all. There we go. Pick up where we left off. So back in chapter 3, verse 7, we see there we go, verse 7. This reference, and we'll see it come out of the whole book of Esther. So in the first month, which is the month Nisan, in the 12th year of King Ahasuerus, there's our word in the singular, lot, or pur, P-U-R. In the plural Hebrew form, it's Purim, and that's our full holiday name. that is the lot, was cast before Haman from day to day and from month to month until the 12th month. That is the month Adar. So what's going on here is here we have Haman. He's a non-Jew. He's casting lots. And here it's his means of determining the next Jewish Holocaust. We talked about that last time. So this is his way of determining the will of the gods. He's not acting as a Jew here in casting lots. He's acting as a Persian. So in his use of lots, it's casting, it was a kind of the ancient way, or the ancient Near Eastern way of determining the will of the gods. And he's trying to align his agenda with the agenda of the divine mind, you might say, and trying to determine when is this day going to go down for the extermination of a lot of Jews around in these 127 provinces. So in the modern Jewish context, what we have here is an interesting historical connection. And this is a major holiday for even non-practicing Jews, because if you're a Jew, and you're interested in these holidays. Two of them are of great modern significance, you'll find if you talk to your Jewish friends about Purim, and also, what would you say? Well, I was going to say Yom Kippur. But Hanukkah is another one. I didn't include it in my discussion here, but maybe I should have. But Yom Kippur, that's the Leviticus 16, right? Day of Atonement. Yeah, we talked about that in OT1. While Yom Kippur is a Jewish holiday or a focus that is involving fasting and praying, interestingly, Purim ends up being a party. And there's a lot of partying that goes on. They're going to also focus on giving to the poor, sending food to family and friends, and also this corporate celebration. Maybe they would find a reason to get together and corporately, as a Jewish congregation, get together and have a big feast. Not unlike what we do on our 4th of July. It's a very similar. We celebrate. We have a party, we light off fireworks, we have reason to celebrate. So there's your conversation that you can have. What's interesting even more, if you do the research, what's also true about Yom Kippur and Purim is that both in the history of these holidays, they both involve the casting of lots. You remember back when we talked about Leviticus 16, and the high priest, back in Leviticus 16 in the details, when he has a decision to make between this goat or that goat to become the scapegoat or the going away goat to be sent off into the wilderness, never to be seen or found again, what does he do? Casting lots. Of course, that's a Jewish context, and there's interesting discussion. We won't get into it too much, but yes, this is a kind of a borrowed activity, you might say. But you might say, in that context, for the high priest to cast lots, it's this way of determining, is it this goat or that goat? One goat becomes the sacrificial goat, the other goat gets to become the scapegoat. But here we have, again, the casting of lots, which is an interesting connection between these two holidays. But in the context of Haman, we go here to casting of lots in Esther 3:7. Here's the irony. While Haman is seeking the divine will of his gods with the casting of lots, what eventually happens in the story of Esther is Haman hears from God eventually. And there's irony there because he's going to hear from the God of the Jews, the one true God, in the determination of who's going to receive you might say, the Holocaust or the divine judgment. It's going to end up falling on him, and his head will go in the noose, not Israel's. So there's the divine. So what's interesting is if you have a conversation with a Jewish friend, you can really bring in, I think, a really rich theological conversation in focusing on, look at God at work. He's working behind the scenes. And you celebrate Purim as a means of, in a way, celebrating the irony of the divine hand of God working behind the scenes in your Jewish history. You might be the one informing them of that, because a lot of them may not know their Bible that well. But you, being the Bible expert, can go back to these Old Testament passages and talk about this. Fair enough? So that's the significance of Purim. So now let's go back to the narrative and pick up where we were leaving off last week in chapter 4. Now what's interesting is we see some of the character come through in the characters that show up in the story of Esther. We have Esther herself, and I would argue great courage, kind of leaping off the page here. So let's look at, we understand she's in the middle of Haman's plot in chapter 4, verse 16. Here's what Esther's doing in her reply to Mordecai. Mordecai's warning her. Here's what she says: "Go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa," verse 16, "and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens also will fast in the same way, and thus I will go into the king, which is not according to the law, and if I perish, I perish." So we talked about this situation, and she's asking for fasting here, which I think by implication involves prayer. And there again is a connection to the, kind of an indirect connection to, well, who are they praying to? Who are they fasting before? The God of the Jews. And she's asking her faith community to stand with her in solidarity through fasting and prayer, right? So here's another indirect reference to God. Esther's going on the offensive. Think of it that way. And after 3 days of fasting, Esther is going to literally walk into her lion's den. If you make the connection of an Esther person like a Daniel person, right? I think it's fair to do that. In chapter 5, we have the lion's den for Esther. So let's see here. I think, Thomas, you are here. Let's have you be our first reader today in chapter 5, verses 1. Let's get a little bit of the context here down through, well, when I tell you to stop.
Therefore, Esther put on her royal robes and stood in the inner court of the king's palace, in front of the king's quarters. While the king was sitting on his royal throne beside the throne room opposite the entrance of the palace. When the king saw Queen Esther standing in the court, she won favor in his sight. And he held out to Esther the golden scepter that was in his hand. Then Esther approached and touched the tip of the scepter, and the king said to her, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request? It shall be given to you, even to the half of my kingdom." And Esther said, "If it pleases the king, let the king and Haman come today to a feast that I prepared for the king." And the king said, "Bring Haman quickly, so that we may do as Esther has asked." So the king and Haman came to the feast, and Esther had prepared.
That's good. Just pause there. So the trouble situation, the potential conflict would have been if Ahasuerus would have interpreted Esther's entering his court, kind of abruptly. It was not permitted unless you were invited. So she's initiating this, and as we saw last week, she's either A, potentially risking her own life as she proceeds, or B, risking the life of her fellow countrymen back home if she doesn't do anything, or if she remains silent. Remember, Mordecai said, "No, the Lord has placed you for such a time as this," right? That's that divine hand is at work. So here we see the reputation of Esther preceding her. So her status, in the royal court has preceded her. Not any different than Daniel. We have examples, or even Joseph, if we go all the way back to his time in Egypt. We have similarities in the biblical context for this kind of reputation. So she's going to invite both King and Haman to another banquet she's going to oversee. So we continue to see down in chapter 5, starting in verse 9. Let's see. Let's have, not that I'm trying to be mean, but Christina, could you read? You're on the very first page here. Read verse 9 and then down to verse 10 and 12, down through 10 through 12.
Haman went out that day happy and in high spirits, but when he saw Mordecai and at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence. He was filled with rage against Mordecai.
Rage, yeah, that's good. Keep going in verse 10 through 12.
Nevertheless, Haman restrained himself and went home. Calling together his friends, Zeresh, his wife, Haman boasted to them about his vast wealth, his many sons, and all the ways the king had honored him, and how he had elevated him above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all, Haman added. I'm the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to the banquet she gave.
Okay, so verse 12. So you see here a couple things are showing up, and this is what reveals us to the true character, true nature of Haman. Of course, his deep hatred for the Jews shows up there in verse 12. 10 through 12, I call this the big man, little man syndrome. You know, he cannot be magnified enough of his own. Look at what the king has done for me. Let me remind you of how wealthy I am because of my status in the king's court. And then down in verse 14, Zeresh is the one who really has the correct theology here. She says, verse 14, then Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends said to him, have a gallows 50 cubits high made, and in the morning ask the king to have Mordecai hanged. Then joyfully with the king go to the banquet and advise, and the advice pleased Haman, so he had the gallows made. So this is I don't know if you've ever had the situation of working with people like this in a real job out there in the real world, people who are always so about promoting themselves at the expense of everybody else. We talked about that before. It's really an excellent illustration of at least a biblical account of how these folks like Esther and like Mordecai are behind the scenes in very hostile situations. Things can turn on a dime and go south really quick. If they say the wrong thing, do the wrong thing, act at the wrong time, and or their identity as Jews comes forth, things like that can become things can go south really quick. But after this, we start to see the irony showing up. Haman shows up, and he's very pleased and very proud as a peacock. He thinks that all of this, what Esther's doing is to honor him and to elevate him. The irony, again, is that while he, thinks he's being honored by the queen, he does not know yet that she, Esther, is part of the people group who he is seeking to destroy. He doesn't know that yet. So let's move on to the next section here in chapter 6. Here's my question to start this text off. This is another question. I don't know how oftentimes it shows up in the commentaries, but could God himself be behind another sleepless night of a pagan king? Yeah, I think so. That's the question that I ask here. What, or more importantly, who prompts a sleepless king to go and get and read kind of the record daily, journal of the king? And that's what we have in chapter 6, beginning in verse 1. During that night, the king could not sleep. So he gave an order to bring the book of records, the Chronicles, and they were read before the king. Because he's thinking, have this ever happened to you? You get that 3:30 in the morning thought in your head that just won't go away because you think that you forgot to do something. Was there a check in that checklist box? Did I forget to do that? Did I forget to, like this morning, I actually woke up and sometime in the night thought, Greg, you didn't put your laptop in your man bag, And guess what I did? I drove all the way to work. I had to drive all the way back because I forgot my laptop, But I thought about it. I remember I thought about that, and then why didn't I do that when I got the prompting? I don't know if that was from the Lord or just me remembering that I'm a knucklehead because I put my laptop on my dining room table. That's where I was doing my Saturday work, and I forgot to put it back. Otherwise I forget. So he finds this book in verse 2, and he found written what Mordecai had reported. Remember his attempt to protect the king from the assassination attempt. That's what we have in the details of verse 2. And the king said, well, what honor or dignity have I bestowed on Mordecai for this? I forgot to do it. Then the king's servants who attended him said, nothing has been done for him. All right, so that's what we have in verses 1 through 3. And there's details that are kind of ironic here, just as the king is working out the details of how to fulfill this promise or this requirement to honor Mordecai. For this moment, we see Mordecai strategically placed as one who, while he deserves honor for the king, remember there's someone else who's thinking he's going to get the honor from the king, and that's Haman. So for such a time as this, now we have Mordecai, he's got his moment for such a time as this, like Esther before. And Mordecai strategically is placed here. He's one who rightly deserves honor from the king. I guess as any of us in ministry, is whether we're a missionary or in missions or youth pastoring, is really important for me. This is what I struggled with, I think, when I was in my early days of being a youth pastor, is working in such a way that my reputation as a youth pastor precedes me and not me trying to elevate myself. Does that make sense? Sometimes when we get caught in a cycle of, I've got to do this to make myself look good. Sometimes that's when God kind of chops that tree down, And here's a situation again of Mordecai. He's merely being faithful in all aspects of him following the Lord, and we don't have all the details, but here he's got this reputation. He saved the king's life. He didn't have to do that, but here he is saving the life of a pagan king. That's what faithful Jews do, right? If we're in a secular workplace, sometimes we're called to do things, not to be sinful, but to be loyal, and we follow through with those things. And, because of doing that, we earn a reputation of being a faithful, a loyal, dot our I's and cross our T's kind of employee. As Christians, those are the employees we strive to be in whatever workplace or vocation, God calls us to do. So that's another walkaway. So the irony continues, and if we look over at verses 6 through 9, so Haman came in, and the king said to him, "What is to be done for the man whom the king desires to honor?" You just got to pause there. You can just picture Mordecai, the classic cartoon scene, pulling himself up, sticking out his chest, and yes, what's going to come next? And Haman said to himself, "Whom would the king desire to honor more than me?" Notice he says it to himself, So we're given we're listening in over the shoulder of Haman. Then Haman says out loud to the king, "For the man whom the king desires to honor. And let him bring a royal robe, which the king has worn, and the horse on which the king is ridden, and on whose head the royal crown has been placed, and let the robe and the horse be handed over to the king's most noble princes, and let them array the man whom the king desires to honor, and lead him on horseback through the city square, and proclaim him. Thus it shall be done to the man whom the king desires to honor." This is great setup for the irony which is about ready to come, right? And down through verse 10, Haman thinks it's him, but by now in the story we already know that Haman has hanged himself. There it is, the perfect picture. So the king reveals who he is really set to honor. In verse 10, let's see, Rebecca, where are you? Right here. Well, right. I thought she was here. Back here. Yeah, there you are. Read verse 10 for us. Thank you. Chapter 6.
And then the king said to Haman, "Take quickly the robes of the horse as you have said, and to do so for Mordecai the Jew, who is sitting at the king's gate. Do not fall short in anything of all that you have done."
Okay, let's just pause there. Yeah. So there's another, I think, a subtle hint of the Lord working behind the scenes. And it's there in the words of the king. So the king says to Haman, "And do so for Mordecai," not just any old Mordecai, right? Mordecai the Jew. In other words, Jew, he's a Jew, and who's the God of the Jews, right? God is connected to this particular Jewish man, Mordecai, I think. I might be stretching it, but the question here, I think, is who is the God of the Jews? Who's, and we remember the, I kind of link it, if I was, going to preach on this, I might do something kind of fancy and link it back to when Haman was casting lots, He's determining the will of the Lord. And I think here in the text is, finally we have the answer to the lots. The will of the Lord is now being determined, and it's falling on who's going to receive the divine judgment in this story. Well, it's not going to be the Jews. It's going to be, in this case, Haman. All right, so Haman's going to leave in humiliation. He returns back to his wife, and we see as Zeresh showing up with correct theology, I think, about the situation. And she's going to speak in verse 13. So, verse 13, Haman recounted to Zeresh, his wife, in verse 13, and all of his friends, everything that had happened to him. Then his wise men and Zeresh, his wife, said to him, if Mordecai, before whom you have begun to fall, is of Jewish origin, here we have the emphasis again, you will not overcome him, but you'll surely fall before him. Isn't that interesting? It's almost as if they're saying, Zeresh and these friend counselor types, if you're dealing with the God of the Jews, you might as well give up right now. We know a little bit about that God, the God of the Jews. Well, in fact, don't you remember what happened to Daniel? That kind of a thing? Is there something going on with previous situations where the God of the Jews particularly showed up and brought about a little mini miracle, right? Could it be that the reputation of the God of the Jews is preceding him in this situation, kind of subtly underneath the text here? What do you think? Possibly? I mean, why is she saying it? Why are they, while they were still talking with him, the king's eunuchs, verse 14, arrived and hastily brought Haman to the banquet with which Esther had prepared. So things are starting to escalate and kind of rev up here. It's just like the Daniel situation in the lion's den, tipping the dominoes in such a way that, the king issues a decree for that particular scenario. So something like that back in Daniel chapter 6, verse 25. Those are the kinds of things that happen. It's we saw similar situations, even before the Israelites get to the promised land. Rahab shows up and starts saying, I've heard of your God. I've heard of his reputation. Remember that? Back in the book of Joshua. So we have the king in, let's see, chapter 7, down in verse 3. So we have this exchange and this dialogue going on. So now we have she's not outside of the lion's den situation. Now the second part of Mordecai's caution is going to be, Esther's basically going to say, this is who I am. She's going to reveal her identity as a Jew. And she's also going to reveal Haman's plot to kill the Jews. In chapter 7, verses 3 through 4, let's see here. Could I have Christopher back there? Could you read for us right there? Chapter 7, 3 and 4.
And Queen Esther replied, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it pleases the king, let my life be given to me as my petition, and my people as my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and be annihilated. Now, if we had only been sold as slaves, men or women, I would have remained silent. For the trouble would not be
commensurate, maybe?
with the obedience to the king.
Go, pause there, that's fine. So we have Esther, stepping in. Of course, she's got the prayer support and fasting support of the faithful community of the day. So Haman's plan becomes unraveled. He's beginning now to beg for his life before the queen. Let's see here. So we see, what did I do? I messed up here. Okay, so he's asking the who question in verse 5, and Esther is going to say, a foe and an enemy is this wicked Haman. So she's identifying Haman for who he is. Haman there's one little verse there in verse 6b. I just kind of lost it here. Then Haman became terrified before the king and the queen. And the king arose in his anger from drinking wine and went into the palace garden. But Haman stayed to beg for his life. There it is, from Queen Esther. For he saw that harm had been determined against him by the king. So when the king returns from the palace garden, in the place where they were drinking, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was. And the king said, will he even assault the queen with me in my house? And the word went out of the king's mouth, and they covered Haman's face. So this is in the ancient world, covering your face was something you did when you were being shamed or humiliated. And in this case, there's a lot of irony here, but while the king sees him as trying to assault his wife, the queen, he's just begging for his life. And so because of all of this, all of the above, the orders go out for Haman to be hung. So they hanged in verse 10, Haman on the gallows which he had prepared for Mordecai. There the author has given us the irony firsthand. The gallows that was intended for, Mordecai then are used on Haman. And you know that. You've heard that before. And so the king's anger subsides. All right, so that's verses 9 and 10. All right, so how does this start knocking the dominoes over? Esther's not out of the danger zone yet. In chapter 8, verses 5 through 6, she's now having to talk to the king about this edict. Something has to happen with regards to this earlier edict. So she says in verses 5 through 6, if it pleases the king, and if I found favor before him, and the matter seems proper to the king, and I am pleasing in his sight, notice all the focus and attention goes on who I am and who my reputation is, and if it pleases you. I mean, she's requesting something here. Let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the king's 127 provinces. So in response, the king says, how can I endure to see the calamity which shall befall my people, and how can I endure to see the destruction of my kindred? No, that's, Esther's words there. So king, he responds in verse 7, behold, I've given the house of Haman to Esther, number 1, and him they have hanged on the gallows because he had stretched out his hands against the Jews. So then he continues in verse 8, now you write to the Jews as you see fit in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring for a decree which is written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's signet ring, so that it may not be revoked. So first of all, what is he going to do? He's going to promote Mordecai. He does that in verse 7. And then he's going to issue Mordecai here to be involved in writing this new edict on his behalf. And this edict is going to go out to 127 Persian provinces, and Jerusalem was just one of the 127 that were included. In the words of the edict, we have, starting down in verse 11, in them the king granted the Jews who were in each and every city the right to assemble and to defend their lives. This is harsh language, right? To destroy, to kill, and to annihilate the entire army of any people or province which might attack them, including children and women, and to plunder their spoil. Now, that's pretty harsh. Verse 12, let's go down to verse 13. On one day in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, the 13th day of the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, a copy of the edict to be issued as law in each and every province was published to all the people, so that the Jews should be ready for this day to avenge themselves on their enemies. So Mordecai goes public in his elevated position, and what we see here in response to this, the Jews are going to respond with great rejoicing and celebration and feasting. Mordecai in verse 15 went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white. Those were originally supposed to be for Haman, right? With a large crown of gold and a garment of fine linen and purple. And the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. For the Jews there was a light and gladness and joy and honor. So this is the very first celebration of Purim that's being celebrated right here. And in each and every province, verse 17, in each and every city, wherever the king's commandment and his decree arrived, there was gladness and joy and celebration and great feasting for the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many among the peoples of the land outside of the Jewish communities heard about it for a sense of awe, not a dread like a scaredy cat fear. I think this is a sense of awe. And all of the Jews had fallen on them. So what we have going on here is really not just the Jews themselves celebrating and focusing on the God who saved, the God who saves, but this almost, you might say, had a little bit of an evangelistic impact as well. If you've got a bunch of people around and everybody knows who the Jews are, and there's this mean edict coming in version 1, and then maybe a little bit of the Jews praying and fasting back home in these 127 provinces, what's God going to do? And then a miraculous provision, God comes through, and you have edict number 2, people around are going to take note of that. You know, what in the world? Who is this God of the Jews? And I think that's a little bit of what's going on here. This is a sense of awe, not a sense so much of the scaredy cat sense. People were joining, and they joined in the Jewish community out of the awe of what the God of the Jews had done. Not unlike Rahab, like we mentioned before. She's been prepared with some pre-evangelism. The name, the reputation of the God of the Jews has come before his own people, and now I'm interested in joining this community. So it seems like a little bit of that may have been going on as well. All right, well, let's move on. So what happens as a result? So in chapter 9, we see the enactment of this new edict, and I have this picture picked purposely. It's not, I don't think what we have here is this just broad stroke killing spree that actually happens. I think we need to be careful here. In chapter 9, verse 1, I think we have some hints about what it was really about. Verse 1, let's have Austin. Could you read for us?
Now in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, on the 13th day when the king commanded an edict were about to be executed on that day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain the mastery over them, it was turned to the contrary, so the Jews themselves gained the mastery over those who hated them.
Okay, let's just pause there. So this first verse, I think, gives us a little bit of the clues. That idea of hated, and you see that in the very last part of verse 1, is the same word that's used when we talked about the grudge that Joseph's brothers held against Joseph. So when they hated Joseph, and they held that grudge, it's that same basic idea. So here's my little theory. You know, we call it the Jewish diaspora, the Jews that were spread out in various regions in the 127 provinces of Persia. If you were in that diaspora, you'd know in your particular community who the Hamans were, who were those people around who you knew had great hatred towards the Jewish people. You would have known. And I'm thinking that this edict is basically giving this group of, while the first edict was giving these Jew haters a chance to organize and rally against the Jews, now this new edict is allowing the Jews to seek judgment against those Haman types in their community. And I think, I see a little bit of an extension of, if we go all the way back to the beginning, almost, in Genesis chapter 12, it's not the first time that we've seen this kind of thing happen, where the Lord's original promise to Abraham in the Abrahamic covenant I'll bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you, I will curse. The idea there is to revile, almost to hate. There's probably a little semantic overlap there. But in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. So how does the Lord feel against these people who hate his people, who hate God's people? We know what the Lord is going to do in terms of bringing judgment against. So I think that's what we have going on here. And down in verse 3, we see that this response is going to also receive and allow for, the edict is going to allow for the support, extra Persian support of the local community. Even all the princes. So what happens in verse 2? The Jews assemble in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to lay hands on those who sought them harm. So it's not an annihilation of an entire village. I think they're going out and finding the particular Hamanites. I just made that term up. And in verse 3, even all the provinces of the satraps and the governors and those who were doing the king's business assisted the Jews because of the dread of Mordecai that had fallen on them. So Mordecai has a pretty significant role now.
Yeah, I want to ask a question, a quick one.
Okay.
What was Esther thinking about to invite Haman? Because I expected her maybe to invite the king and discuss the issue with the king, because this law cannot be reverted. It has been issued and it has been issued. And Esther knew that Haman is an enemy. So what does she have in mind for inviting Haman also to join her?
Well, what do y'all think? Wouldn't it be just... one of the things that has to be accomplished is the unveiling of Haman, is his undoing. I think Esther's willing to take a risk at this point. I think, by faith, and she knows she has the prayer support of everyone in the community. Mordecai's given her a warning, but for such a time as this, Esther, so she has to be strategic in bringing the king and Haman into the same conversation, right? I think. You got to bring those two together. Otherwise it becomes I'm just speculating here, but a he said, she said kind of thing. But she's being she knows that the king has to hear words from her as well as, the king has to see Haman at the same time of hearing her and answering a question that the king asked Esther. She cannot tell the king. She can only respond to the king at this point. And by responding to the king, with Haman right there, now she's able to, lift the sheets. I use these idioms, I'm sorry. This just expose the situation. All right. Let's see here. We get to the end of the book of Esther. Yay! Finally, we see the details of the event that merge into feast and celebration. And in chapter 9, over at verse 28. So as a result of these new edicts, we have more details given to the feast of Purim. These days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, and every city. And these days of Purim were not to fail among the Jews, or their memory fade from their descendants. And so we have a little bit of a focus there down through verse 32. So Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, was, and with Mordecai, wrote with full authority to confirm the second letter about Purim. And he sent letters again to all the 127 provinces to establish these days of Purim at their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and for their descendants or their seed with instructions for their times. And then we have a little bit at the end here. It seems as if, while Esther gets most of the focus about the book, but we don't want to de-elevate Mordecai. He has the last word in the book. Now King Ahasuerus laid a tribute on the land and on the coastlands of the sea, and all the accomplishments of his authority and strength, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, to which the king advanced him, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia. For Mordecai the Jew was second only to the king, and was great among the Jews, and in favor with a multitude of his kinsmen, one who sought the good of his people, and one who spoke for the welfare, for the shalom of the whole nation of Israel. So Mordecai, ought to get a little bit of credit in all of this as well. Esther and Mordecai together are the superheroes of the day. All right, well, let's take a break. Let's take a 10-minute break, shall we? Austin needs a break, so he's nodding his head in agreement. Let's take a 10-minute break, come back full charged, fully caffeinated, and make a grand charge to the finish line and finish 1st and 2nd Chronicles. If I can get you out early, I will.
Hey, is this the shortest chapter in the Bible?
Which one? Oh, yeah. Well, the shortest chapter, it might very well be. It's a very short chapter. Is there one shorter? One of the Psalms? Yeah. Okay.
It's just 2 verses.
Shortest chapter.
Yeah, no short verses. John.
Third John?
Second John. There's a question here. We're just about to, I think. One of my professors says that we should not pray the imprecatory psalms, and hinted that we should not seek to carry out judgment. Do we always turn the other cheek, or should we open like a water that there are some that hate God's people so fiercely that only option is to take serious and final measures in return for purity?
I want to know the name of that student that asked that question. No, I'm just kidding. Are you still there? Is he still here? I'll speak my answer.
Tyler's, his name is Tyler.
Okay. Great question, Tyler. So for everybody still listening, the question is, you see in the story of Esther and Mordecai acting behind the lines, so to speak, but being involved in a series of events leading to the, in this case, I would argue the judgment against an individual, right? So I'm trying to make a connection to the idea of like Dietrich Bonhoeffer. So there's a similarity between like a historical person like Dietrich Bonhoeffer seeking to bring about political change. So there's the commonality. So when is it right for us to seek political change as it benefits the people of God? That's kind of like the gist. So it's always the right thing to do if you're like, I think, like Esther and Mordecai, praying and seeking the will of the Lord. If it's the will of the Lord to go this direction, step in, say this, or do that in response to the unchristian kingdom that you find yourself in for the benefit of the local church, so to speak, or the local believing, faithful, remnant community, that's always the right thing to do. I think we don't want to get into a situation where we are stepping outside of the will of God and acting on our own behalf.